You present him. Yeah, try to listen to me.
Okay, our first speaker is Bryan, who really needs no introduction to a South American audience, and his paper is Some Difficulties in Modeling the Peopling of the Americas.
My paper is meant to complement Ruth Gruhn's. It will be delivered in English. I saw Ruth struggling with turning her paper into Spanish for the last 3 weeks. I decided I'll just keep to English. She will emphasize the fact that by 11,000 years ago, people in various parts of South America had developed many distinctive technological adaptations to the diverse ecosystems present on this continent. Although not generally recognized, similar diversity also had been developed in North America by that time. A major problem, however, arises from a difference in the perspective of archaeologists working in North or South America. How does the archaeological situation in South and Central America differ from what is known in North America? The main difference is that bifacially flake stone points are much more common throughout the United States and southern Canada than they are in Central and South America. Not only are bifacial points mostly shaped for tipping projectiles, but also for use as knives. They are very abundant in North America, but a great many distinctive point styles were developed by prehistoric North Americans in the interval from the early Holocene into protohistoric times. It is notable that bifacial points are relatively rare south of northern Mexico. In many parts of lowland South America, bifacially flake stone projectile points were not used in early Holocene times, and evidently in some areas, people never did innovate this technology. Spears, darts, and arrows tipped with bone, ground stone, and wooden points, including durable palm wood, evidently proved to be much more effective tools in many forested areas that they continued to be employed into recent times. Just look at the ethnographic collections in the museums. In fact, some people occupying shell middens in southern Brazil evidently did not flake stone at all for extended periods of time. This fact is usually ignored by archaeologists because they are so dependent on finding definitely shaped artifacts that preserve well in all contexts, which of course means stone artifacts. Bifacial stem points are present by early Holocene times in several open environments of South America. But interestingly, even on the relatively unforested Sabana de Bogotá, bifacial points were rarely used. We all know that bifacially flake stone projectile points are very important for modern archaeologists, but evidently they were not very important for many native South Americans. I don't know of any part of the world where bifacially flake stone points are as common as in southern North America, where they prevail for many millennia in most ecosystems. North American archaeologists thrive on this abundance because it is easy to distinguish point styles from which classification schemes can be developed that assist greatly in defining prehistoric cultures, phases, periods, and so forth. Archaeologists were able to do wonders with points and potsherds even before radiocarbon dating was developed. This unusual chronological control of stylistic change in prehistoric material culture, which is instilled in all archaeology students, is a major reason why many North American archaeologists feel they are better trained than South American archaeologists, and therefore have the right to say that their methods and models are the best for South America as well as for North America. It also means that North American archaeologists have a fixation on bifacial points to the extent that other artifact types tend to be slighted. In fact, an archaeological site lacking bifacial points in the lower levels is sometimes abandoned without digging to the bottom, because if only flakes are present, there is nothing diagnostic to work with, and the artifact sample size is inadequate. Even if an early radiocarbon date has been obtained on strata yielding retouched flakes, but no bifacial points in or immediately above the dated level, they commonly suspect that either the dated material or the flakes are somehow intrusive. Another argument often presented is that the flakes, even if retouched, were somehow created naturally. The North American archaeologist's fixation on ubiquitous projectile points helps to explain why the Clovis first model has so easily been accepted in North America, and why North American archaeologists, few of whom have field experience in Latin America, insist that the model should hold for the entire Western Hemisphere. Furthermore, some insist that any evidence that does not fit the model must somehow be wrong, whether the site is in North Central or South America. Despite radiocarbon and other evidence to the contrary, any reported site that does not fit the accepted model is simply ignored or explained away by proposing alternative hypotheses, none of which are tested by the proponent. This procedure is not how science should work. Models are based on a body of fact, plus a set of assumptions stated as working hypotheses, which are testable against facts, new facts. After a period of time, many, if not most, working hypotheses are disproven, and a new body of factual evidence accrues. So a new model must be formulated that better fits the available body of facts. In science, models are proposed to explain available facts, but if it becomes necessary to force a considerable amount of evidence to fit a model, it becomes time to change the model. New evidence has been accruing for well over a quarter of a century that the Clovis first model, and that's how I refer to it, Clovis first and Clovis firsters, those who follow it. The Clovis first model is wrong, but many, probably most, North American archaeologists continue to support that model, partly because a mystique has developed around beautifully flaked Clovis fluted points. Not only do they represent an epitome of skilled craftsmanship, but the finds of a true Clovis point, if you find one, the finder can immediately assume that it is about 11,000 years old, because they know that they have found at several dated sites, have been found at several dated sites at that age. but no later than about 10,800 years ago. Various styles of fluted points persist much later, but true Clovis points drop out of the dated record before about 10,800 years ago. Because Clovis points have been dated between 11,200 and 10,900 BP at several sites, actually about a dozen, some archaeologists vehemently argue that this means that the Clovis first model must be correct. However, most archaeologists remain quiet. If asked, they say they are conservative archaeologists, meaning they support the mainstream majority view and want to stay out of any controversy. For some time, a consensus has been maintained among North American archaeologists that the earliest generally accepted evidence for Paleo-Indians is that they were mammoth and giant bison hunters who made distinctive Clovis fluted points. The fact that Clovis points have been found throughout the eastern United States, but less commonly in the West, and only a few in South America, as far south as Panama, has led to the extrapolation that these big game hunters spread rapidly in all directions from the Great Plains and even peopled South America, where Clovis points, true Clovis points, have not been found. Not yet, anyway. Based on the generally accepted assumption that the advanced flaking technology exhibited on Clovis points must have originated elsewhere and could not have been developed indigenously by knappers experimenting with edge retouch flakes, which seems simple enough. People have developed, extrapolated, all the way back to the European Upper Paleolithic. Thus, the classic Clovis first model has European big game hunters spreading across Siberia, the Bering Land Bridge, and unglaciated central Alaska and Yukon to move southward through an hypothetical ice-free corridor that conveniently opened between the Laurentide continental ice mass and glaciers that covered most of British Columbia. These rapidly moving Upper Paleolithic big game hunters suddenly appeared about 11,200 years ago on the high plains where they hunted mammoths. This exciting model, commonly found in the popular literature, as well as in textbooks, ignores many facts. For example, there are no Clovis fluted points in Siberia, and actually no true Clovis points in Alaska. 2, there are several reported sites in the eastern woodlands of the United States that yield artifacts, even bifacial points, below Clovis levels, dated Clovis levels. So stratigraphically pre-Clovis sites are now known in the eastern US. 3, there is only one known Clovis megamammal kill site east of the Great Plains, and none west of southeastern Arizona. Evidently, most people that made Clovis points were not specialized big game hunters, but general hunter-gatherers like the later archaic people. I really don't see a significant difference between so-called Paleo-Indian and archaic in economy. Except on the high plains, well, that isn't truly true there. A sufficient explanation for the presence of several mammoth kill sites on and near the high plains is the hypothesis that opportunistic hunters from the eastern woodlands came up onto the high plains to take advantage of animals under stress that congregated around water holes that were drying up during the so-called Clovis drought from about 11,000 years ago. I think that's a sufficient explanation for Clovis on the high plains. Clovis kill sites. There's never anything found below those levels at any of those sites. There's not occupation sites, there's simply kill sites. For in the West, the earliest radiocarbon dated sites containing bifacial points do not yield fluted points of any kind, but rather leaf-shaped and stemmed forms. Available dates suggest that sometime before 11,000 years ago, fluted points developed east of the high plains, while stemmed points developed west of the plains. Fifth point, Los Tapiales, Guatemala, which Ruth and I excavated. It's the only excavated Clovis site in Central America. It's dated only 10,700 BP. Too late to support the model of rapid southward migration that supposedly peopled Central and South America. So this report is usually ignored. Also, all sites in North or South America dated earlier than Clovis are simply ignored or explained away by the Clovis firsters because they do not support the accepted model. As Ruth will explain, there are a number of sites in South America that do not fit the Clovis first model. In fact, essentially all late Pleistocene and early Holocene sites in South America have to be explained away by Clovis firsters. Ruth and I contend that it is long past time to look at alternative models, which are really variations on a single model. For the peopling of the North and South America, this model has been in the literature for a considerable time. Next. An alternative model for the peopling of the Americas should be sufficient to fit all available evidence and should be simple. The basic questions to be answered are: when did people first colonize the Western Hemisphere? What route did they use to enter the Americas? And what level of technology did they bring with them? A model with simple answers are that the earliest people came from Eastern Asia into Alaska sometime in the late Pleistocene, carrying an edge-retouched flake industry, plus many normally perishable artifacts. Unfortunately, including good clothing and probably watercraft, made of wood or skin or both. Unfortunately, available evidence creates many complexities for this simple model when trying to encompass these questions and answers into a model based on testable working hypotheses. I will still try to keep it simple. Yeah, thanks. I base my answer to the first question largely on the fact that all American skeletal material belongs to the species Homo sapiens. Although it is possible that an earlier transitional form with heavy brow ridges could have come first. The fact that there are archaeological sites dated to at least 350,000 years ago in central Siberia, Japan, and North China suggests to me that we may yet confirm solid evidence for occupation of the Americas considerably earlier than several sites now dated 35,000 years or more older. Most importantly, We should not construct arbitrary temporal barriers like the Clovis first model has done that prevents consideration of earlier reported evidence. Next. The question of what route the earliest people took is complicated by the fact that the best evidence for the earliest reported sites is now in South America, which has led to various trans-Pacific and transatlantic hypotheses. Such hypotheses are difficult, if not impossible, to test and remain unlikely because there is nothing early enough in any oceanic islands to support a really early transoceanic migration. Most likely, early people traversed the western Pacific coasts, Southeast Asia, China, Japan, to eventually enter Alaska. Despite the fact that nothing earlier than about 12,000 years old has been found in Alaska, I think this situation, which is actually based on the fact that essentially all these sites have been found in the same context, in Lewis, in the central Alaska. They never really looked anywhere else. I think this situation will change when archaeologists expand their search to unglaciated refugia on and near the Alaskan coast, as well as looking beneath glacial deposits and in new contexts in the unglaciated interior. Except for a few refugia, the South Alaskan coast remained glaciated between about 25,000 and 11,000 years ago. Next slide. I should point out that the hypothetical ice-free corridor, this thing here, which has been the usual model, people came through there. We actually, Ruth and I, live in that corridor, the south end of it. Proposed as an early migration route east of the Rocky Mountains, has now been called into question. Geologists have determined that the northern part of the corridor in the Great Slave Lake Basin, if I can find that up here, in this area, remained glaciated into the mountain passes along the Continental Divide between 30,000 and about 11,000 years ago. It was closed during that expanded long period of time. In sum, the ice-free corridor was closed to traffic between 30,000 and 11,000 years ago. People either entered through the interior earlier, or else they came along the Pacific coast, perhaps in watercraft. They could have skirted the ice. South Alaska was all glaciated along the coast, but there were refugia, islands and so on, that were not glaciated. The third question, what level of technology do the earliest people bring with them, has elicited the most controversy because of the long-maintained fixation on bifacial projectile points, especially fluted points, by North American archaeologists. Several North American archaeologists who have obtained some field experience in Latin America, these include Krieger, McNeish, Willie, Rouse, Hurt, Roon, and myself, have put forward variations on a model that the earliest people brought with them a simple lithic technology on a middle Paleolithic level that consisted mainly of edge-trimmed flakes, and if available, tools flaked on river cobbles. Of course, such artifacts continue to be made throughout prehistoric times. So by themselves, they are not diagnostic of an early period. You can pick them up and at Moche sites, for instance, the Peruvian coast. They were still used in Alberta for cutting up bison in the 1880s. You can't just pick these things up on the surface and say, aha, this is early. You've got to find them, excavate them from early geological contexts, which are now more easily dated, not only by radiocarbon, but thermoluminescence and optical luminescence and so on, than when the prevailing model based on bifacial points associated with extinct fauna, that was the only way you could know that it was Pleistocene in age, was first promulgated back in the 1930s and 40s. This simple but sufficient model I'm presenting was presented more than 30 years ago, because only retouched flakes are found in so many early sites in North as well as South America. In fact, bifacial points never developed in many parts of South America, although they were innovated quite early in unforested open areas, including Patagonia, where, as on the Great Plains, the most productive way to make a living was to hunt large mammals before as well as long after some species became extinct. One North American archaeologist dug a cave in Peru that contained retouched flakes, radiocarbon dated older than 12,000 years. However, as his report was criticized for having only one early date, and the shelter immediately had somewhat mixed stratigraphy, he decided that it would be better for his reputation not to defend his evidence, but rather to put down all other sites in South America that did not fit the Clovis first model. Tom Lynch's arguments have become influential because they are readily acceptable by most North American archaeologists who prefer to maintain the 70-year-old Clovis first model to which they have become addicted after several generations of reiteration. Next slide. As Ruth will explain, supporters of the Clovis first model have had to reject contradictory evidence from South America. This has created an impasse, which we thought was finally broken by the evidence from the Monteverde site in Chile, where a group of supposedly impartial skeptics accepted the evidence presented that people occupied that uniquely well-preserved site, yielding an abundance of non-lithic artifacts by at least 12,500 years of radiocarbon years ago. More than a millennium before Clovis points were first used to hunt mammoths on the high plains. Monteverde gives us a glimpse, I think an important glimpse, of the spectacular artifacts of wood, fiber, feathers, and so forth that the earliest Americans undoubtedly brought with them, along with that simple lithic technology. But no, the Clovis firsters remain adamant that there must be something wrong with the evidence from Monteverde because it is too early. Alternative bizarre hypotheses presented are that mastodons created the site when they used it as a latrine. They brought all this vegetation from the high Andes, from the coast, and so on, 1,000 kilometers away, and they all sat there and shat. Or that glacial outwash extended over the area and mixed things up to make it look like an early archaeological site. These desperate hypotheses are easily disproven, but they have placed a cloud over the site, which means that the Clovis first model lives on in the minds of many North American archaeologists. I contend that valuable time is being wasted and unnecessary verbiage being expended by archaeologists who continue to defend the Clovis first model. We must adopt a simple, sufficient, and flexible model which explains reported evidence and does not require that dozens of sites throughout the Western Hemisphere be explained away. At the same time, this model allows elimination of the artificial barrier to acceptance of all sites dated earlier than about 11,500 years ago. Hopefully, acceptance of this venerable but sufficient model, which has been ignored for too long, will precipitate a search for more sites that contain simple retouch flake industries in early datable contexts. Thank you. I might say there might be a few off-prints back on the shelf around the corner of a paper that was just published last year in the UNESCO volume on the Historia General de America Latina. And my paper is on the original Keepling. And do pick up the references too. It's a separate thing.
¿Hay tiempo para alguna pregunta, algún comentario, reflexión todavía? Sí, el doctor Pocharelli.
You mean human skeletal material? Yeah. So far, the earliest skeletal material, I think, is in South America. The earliest human skeletal material in a dated context is in South America. And I believe that some goes back to more than 11,500. In North America, there's a great controversy going on that Rob is in the middle of. And this is that the Native Americans, the Indians, are demanding that all human skeletal material be reburied if it's found in the United States. And a lot of, well, several human skeletons have been found and dated. One of them, I think, almost 11,000 years old, and it was reburied before it could ever be studied. As they are all Homo sapiens, I suspect that there are many human burials that are sitting on museum shelves and not thought to be particularly early. If they were dated, they would be a lot earlier than we think. This is the case, actually. Spirit Cave in Nevada, which is mummified slightly, was excavated 40 years ago. And because the beadwork and the moccasins and everything looked not particularly old, it was just put on the shelf and thought to be maybe 2,000 to 3,000 years old. And then they wanted to test whether skin and hair would come out, or bone and hair would come out the same in radiocarbon age. They tested and they found that this skeleton is 9,400 years old. Well, now the local Paiute want this to be reburied. Well, the Paiute weren't anywhere near there until just a few hundred years ago. I think this is a serious problem in the United States, but this should not be a problem anywhere in Latin America. So I think that dating a lot of human skeletal material, Arroyo Seco is one of the oldest good cemeteries anywhere in the New World. And there will be earlier dated sites.
Tom? Sí.
Alan, I appreciate your talk. It was interesting and well articulated, but it seems that in some ways you were speaking to an extreme opinion. If you go to Europe, Australia, many parts of the old world, people quite some time ago thought the Clovis first model was dead. And there are many people in North America who don't adhere to the model. And I think that in North America, many North American archaeologists are beginning to see, finally, that the cultural diversity in South America needs to be explained in ways different from the Clovis first model. My impression is that the Clovis first model is supported by a much smaller group of North Americans who still struggle to explain the early archaeological record of North America, which still has problems in both the Clovis and pre-Clovis levels. I can appreciate where you're coming from, but it seems like the argument could be put more back toward the center a little bit.
Well, you may be right, but I have spoken recently with quite a few archaeologists, and they still believe that Clovis must be the first. And just as an example, there are several sites west of the plains in the Great Basin, for instance, that are, and nearby, that are dated 12,000 years old. Now, these are just simply ignored because they're not Clovis. It has to be, Clovis has to be the first in the West, and yet all the dates that are in the West on fluted points are later than the earliest dates on points, which are stemmed. But there still is insistence that fluted points have to be the earliest in the West as well as everywhere else.
This is Rob Bonnickson speaking. Just a couple comments. First, since the early 1990s, I think the problem of the peopling of the Americas has gradually begun to change as genetic evidence and skeletal evidence has been brought into the general discussion of the peopling of the Americas. Prior to that time, much of the argumentation was based on archaeological evidence. And it seems to me like that the question of who were the first Americans, as it has been addressed, suggests another approach. It suggests that there might have been multiple groups that came to the Americas, and I was wondering if you think that there's a single answer to the peopling of the Americas, or does the answer lie in developing several different models that will explain the variability, rather than having all variability in the Americas come from a single founding population as advocated by the Clovis first model?
Well, I certainly don't think that there was a single migration. People were dribbling into the Americas for a very long time. I don't think it was an intentional migration. It's just expansion of population around the Pacific Rim. And eventually they got into Alaska and went south. Now, yes, genetic evidence is going to be very important and so on. And I think it will complement, but I still believe that it has to be archaeological evidence that is going to resolve the problem. And this is, unfortunately, that means it is going to be simple flake stone industries. It's all that's going to be found. And skeletal. But most early sites do not have skeletal material, human skeletal material. If you're lucky, you can get it, and then get it dated too directly, which is very good. whereas most of these skeletons sitting on museum shelves were excavated before radiocarbon, and they've just been ignored. But I do hope that there is a project in hand to make sure that everything that has to be reburied is dated first and studied properly.